Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Fortified, Bolstering, Skittish, and the Awakened pattern is the same as it was last week, so it's still on the A pattern. This is a pretty good week for high-level key pushing, because Bolstering is kind of the only really bad affix on the list. You know, Fortified is better than Tyrannical for high keys, and Skittish is one of the affixes that can be most easily mitigated and cost you the least time, because it doesn't, you know, if you're playing it right, it doesn't really cost you any time. For lower level keys, it can be a really frustrating week, especially in pugs. You've got Bolstering, which is always notoriously difficult to play around. You've also got Skittish active, which means that if you have people of varying, gear and skill and damage levels in your group, unless your tank is the overgeared person, if it's one of your DPS players who's really good, or if it's your tank who's a little bit less good or undergeared, this is going to be a really problematic week for you. So it is a good week, though, if you're a high-power tank, carrying a bunch of other people through some keys, because you can do most of the work this week. Not all of it, though, because some target priority is needed to make Bolstering very good. Anyways, let's go into the dungeons. As always, you can find my routes on Raider.io every week, and I'll have a link in the description below to that article. Atal'Dazar is one of these dungeons where Bolstering has big impact, particularly in any pull that involves toxic swords. So a good strategy to use this week in this area is to crowd control Skyscreamers, kill a bunch of swords, and then kill some Skyscreamers afterwards. If you want, you can also do a strategy instead where you you fight them all at once and you focus damage on the Skyscreamer. That is also something that can work, but generally the fastest way to do it would be something like, sneak ahead, sap this Skyscreamer or whatever, pull all 9 of these swords, kill them all at once, and then pull these 3 Skyscreamers together. Or, CC this Skyscreamer, kill these swords, CC this Skyscreamer, kill these swords, and then pull these 2 Skyscreamers together after that is all done. That's one of the ways to lose the least time to Bolstering, but it does require a little bit of that pre-planning with the crowd control, so if you're not able to do that, then obviously don't do that. Freehold is a pretty good dungeon to have Bolstering active in, because there aren't that many packs that have vastly different health pools among the enemies within them. One thing that does have a little bit more health than the stuff that surrounds it is Irontide Enforcers, but it's not that much more health, so if you just focus these as the priority target in the pack, usually you can do big pulls still in here. And most of the pulls in this area, they're not that affected by Bolstering. Neutral enemies and hostile enemies don't bolster onto each other, so it can be pretty safe, actually, to pull. You can continue to pull small enemies with bigger enemies in this dungeon, because they happen to not bolster each other. Rats don't bolster here, the Soggy Ship Rats, so this pull isn't so bad. So all in all, really the one thing that'll get you is if you pull an Irontide Crusher by accident, and then bolster it up 5 times, that can be something that's problematic in here. Otherwise, not too much to worry about. As always in Freehold, I'd recommend fighting the Spider with Harlan, rather than actually trying to go and activate its Obelisk separately. Harlan, one of the easiest bosses to fight an awakened enemy with, and the Spider in particular, very easy with him because he doesn't have an interrupt, and he really doesn't do all that much of anything above 60% health. King's Rest does have some very annoying Bolstering stuff going on in here. If you accidentally get in combat with Minions Azul and other stuff, the Minions Azul bolster that other stuff. So remember that. That's the kind of thing that, if your first Bolstering dungeon of the week is King's Rest, you kind of roll in here and you're used to just letting these things, roll in and while you're fighting this pack, these blue guys. And then you Arcane Torrent them or Mass Dispel them or whatever, and then 6 stacks of Bolstering go on all these things. That is a really bad experience. So try and avoid that, plan around it. If you're going to, you can either, you can send somebody to AoE dispel these with, Cloak of Shadows even, or Arcane Torrent or whatever, by standing on where they're going to spawn. And then, vanishing or whatever. That's one good strategy to deal with this. Otherwise, you can pull this pack up to the gong and just make sure that you're not going to aggro these Minions Azul when they're patrolling around. That's another good option here. And then beyond that, there's not too much bad in the rest of the dungeon around Bolstering. You do probably want to split this room into 2 pulls, unless you're really confident that you're going to be able to kill all these embalming fluids within a couple seconds of each other. Shrine of the Storm, helpfully, a lot of enemies do not bolster in here, except for Tide Sage Initiates. Tide Sage Initiates do still bolster when they die, so be very careful when pulling, Shrine Templar here. If you pull all 16 of these enemies at once, you're going to have a 16 stack of Bolstering on this thing, and if that happens, your best option is actually just run out of the dungeon, wait for it to reset, and then run back in, or all die to it. But Animated Droplets don't bolster, these Abyss Dwellers don't bolster, Eels don't bolster, Dredge Sailors don't bolster. These are Tide Sage Initiates again, so they will bolster. as will the ones around the mini bosses in this area. So my route has opted to just skip this mini boss area entirely because of how obnoxious it is with bolstering. It can still be time efficient to do this area, but it's difficult. So I instead opted to pull these guys because they don't play as badly around bolstering. Up to you, if you're an expert group, you can probably get away with pulling some of these things if you know what you're doing, but there's an extra level of difficulty there, so I decided to omit that from the run this week. Siege of Boralus is a notoriously tricky dungeon with bolstering active. When you have this affix going on in here, you have to be really careful pretty much throughout the whole dungeon. It does open up a strategy of bolstering up an Ashvane spotter and then using that to, one-shot enemies with sighted artillery. You might have seen that happening in the MDI, where actually they didn't bolster it, but they raged it this last weekend. That is an option. It's something you can consider doing, but it's tricky to do. The kind of safer strategy is just to roll through here and, focus damage on the high health targets and try and avoid killing the footmen until, the wave tender's dead. It's really slow. It's kind of awful. I expect Siege of Boralus is going to be one of the worst keystones to get next week. This week. Temple of Sethraliss, really not too bad this week. Bolstering, kind of whatever in here. Most enemies have about the same amount of health as each other, so nothing really too big to worry about, unless in this room it can be a little bit awkward if stuff gets pulled in because it's patrolling later in the pull, so be careful there. Make sure you're not doing that. But beyond that, really nothing too threatening from bolstering. Skittish, not a particularly big problem here either. Can get you, especially when the Shrouded Fang comes in and stuns your tank. That can be a moment where it can be really hard for them to get threat back afterwards, so do watch out for that. And then Fortified, pretty great here. So I'd actually rate Temple probably one of the best dungeons this week, one of the ones that's least impacted by bolstering. Motherlode, not one of the best dungeons this week. Bolstering in here also kind of sucks. My route, I try to avoid pulling all of these off-duty laborer pulls because they are one of the most notorious bolstering problems, but no matter what you do, if you're pulling mechanized peacekeepers, which is the most efficient trash in the dungeon in terms of enemy forces to health ratio, you're going to have a bolstering problem where you just have a bunch of enemies in your pull that have different amounts of health. If you have good target prioritization in your group, if you have the ability to split 80% of your damage onto one target and 20% onto the others, that's going to be really good for you this week, and this can totally work out fine. But in most cases, you're going to have a little bit of a problem in this area. In this dungeon, you're going to have to take more slowly and more meticulously than normal. That makes it, I think it makes it into one of the harder dungeons for this week. Not too much to watch out for in the Underrot this week. I'm showing a route here that involves going over and activating this obelisk here. It's worth noting if you're actually doing this key at a level where the timer is something you're running up against and you need to find ways to save time, you should cut out this part of the dungeon and you should just fight Samrek Beckoner of Chaos with the last boss. It's really not that bad. People are very scared of fighting Samrek with the last boss because the fears, they can get you, but they always fear you directly away from Samrek, so you can use that to your advantage. And I actually do recommend doing this if you're able to do it. But the route that I'm showing off this week is, in my opinion, the best way to not have to fight any extra enemies with the last boss, which I think in the Underrot, people are still pretty scared of doing the fear guy with the last boss, so I want to make sure that kind of route is available too. You can go back to one of my previous weeks, though, if you want to see some examples of routes that skip this area and instead do Samrek with the last boss, and that is definitely the fastest way to do this dungeon. The big thing to worry about here for everybody is make sure that you don't bolster Feral Bloodswarmers. On Fortified bolstering weeks, that's going to be a death sentence, so it's okay if you bolster the rest of the pack a little bit. Focus down that Bloodswarmer first. In fact, a very common strategy among high-level groups is going to be something like, pull a bunch of enemies, focus down one Bloodswarmer, the other stuff is at 40% health and gets a stack of bolstering, and then you pull another Bloodswarmer into that group, focus it down as well, and it all dies at the same time. That's a really good strategy for this room this week. But main thing is just make sure you don't have a bolstering Bloodswarmer. That's going to kill you. A big problem in Tol Dagor this week is the brig area here. Enemies fleeing and picking up more enemies when they're low on health, and then those enemies getting a bunch of stacks of bolstering. That's something you really got to watch out for, so make sure that you are stopping that before it happens. Make sure that you save your crowd control effects for when stuff starts to flee in this area, so that you don't run into that problem of everything spreading out and pulling more stuff in and that becoming a nightmare. You don't actually have to worry about these raiders bolstering the boss if you pull these raiders before you pull the boss, you'll get count from them and they will bolster when they die. If the boss breaks them out of the cages himself, then you won't get count from them, but they also won't bolster when they die. So you can factor that into your route here. I currently have these marked on the route, which means that you're planning to pull them before the boss. If you don't want to do that, then you should unmark them from the route and find a couple enemies elsewhere in the dungeon to pull instead. Waycrest really not too bad this week. The one kind of bolstering threat here is Jagged Hounds. Jagged Hounds are something that have a lot less health than the witches in this area. You can pull them with witches and you can let effigy reconstruction through. My preferred way of dealing with this though is like just CC one of the witches, pull all the dogs back out to, you know, whichever side of the dungeon you're coming from and kill the dogs there. And then you don't have to worry about too much bolstering in this area. The dogs before Matron Brindle, always a little bit of a challenge as well. My favorite strategy for this is DPS player that is somewhat tanky, so like a Havoc Demon Hunter, a rogue with parry or evasion, runs in first, AoEs everything, and then the tank taunts Matron Brindle. The tank taunts Matron Brindle back over this way, the rest of the group kills these hounds right here, and then they won't bolster onto Matron Brindle, and you can go and fight her without those extra stacks of bolstering, and it shouldn't murder your tank quite as bad as if she has 3 of those stacks and is doing 60% more damage. Junkyard with bolstering active is something that people I think are still not really that used to. So you have to just take it slow in this area, you know, make sure that you probably have enough time if you pick up your zap bots to do this dungeon in more pulls than, you know, other dungeons take. But just watch out, you know, make sure you're not having stuff come into pulls towards the end of the run or towards the end of the existing pull. And watch out to make sure that you're not bolstering specifically dangerous enemies. So, you know, weaponized crawlers, right? With a sack of bolstering, that can start to get really bad. If you're in this area, you know, and you have any bullies with bolstering on them, that shockwave it's already a must dodge, but it's an even muster dodge. I don't know if that's how I should use that word, but whatever. And yeah, that's kind of the main threat this week is just, you know, for the most part, you can avoid pulling enemies with different amounts of health. Some spots it's kind of unavoidable. It's possible to do this. So like if your group is really bad at not having bolstering happen, just fight these toxic monstrosities by themselves and don't pull anything else with them. But what I recommend is still pull some enemies with them and cleave off of the toxic monstrosity. Just make sure that you're doing damage proportional to everything's health pool and make sure you're aware of that. Really not too much you can do about your pulling decisions in Workshop. The main thing that I'd recommend is in this area, you do have a little bit of agency. So you can actually pull this waste processing unit and this dog together and then kill them separately and then go and pull the rest of the stuff. And again, hard focus this dog, make sure that it is dying really quickly, or else CC it back here and pull these living wastes away because they have so much less health than the dog. If they die first and give this thing 9 stacks of bolstering, that's going to be really bad for you. The rest of the dungeon kind of just plays itself, you know, try and do damage proportional to how much health everything has. One thing you might not know about this area is between these 2 spider tanks, it's the one that's further up that starts the timer when it dies for the helicopter thing to come down and pick you up. So if you're pulling these 2 together, you should kill this one maybe 5 or 10 seconds early. You'll have to deal with the bolstering stack on the other one, but by the time you're then done killing this one, the helicopter should have landed and that'll save you some time. So that's a little thing that you may not have known about. This is the one that controls that helicopter landing. That's it for this week in Mythic Plus. Hope this video helped. If it did, remember to like and subscribe and stuff. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Ratnos. And if you're interested in some Shadowlands Alpha class changes coverage, I have some of that here on this channel as well that you might be interested in. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.